This is Brent Allen Winters, common lawyer. Commonlawyer.com, coming at you from the remote hinterlands of the Wabash River Valley, where the hogs, the frogs, and the dogs keep up a racket all night long. The laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. Let's go to the Elementary Catechism on the Constitution of the United States by Arthur J. Stansbury, published the year 1828. We're about to the end of it, 333 questions. Oh, we're close. Oh, we could finish today if things go smooth, but we'll just see. I'm on the last page of the Catechism. Suppose I sue my neighbor. This is a question. Catechism is, remember, a compounded word, catechism. A schism is a Greek word, and it is the word from which we derive our word echo. Echo. That's a response, you see. Those German-speaking people on the east side of Switzerland and Austria too, they get up in those mountains, and those goat herders up there would holler, and then the noise would come back. It would repeat to them. They could hear it coming back, 1, 2, 3, 4 times. You've heard echoes. The reason was because those mountains, like the Matterhorn, you've heard of the Matterhorn. Notice the Matterhorn's pointy. Why is it so pointy? Why isn't it low roll? Well, it could be a high rolling hill like the Appalachians or the Ozarks in Missouri. They're high rolling hills, not thousands of feet, but some a thousand less, but they're mountains for us around where we live. The Ozarks coming across southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, southern Illinois, Indiana, on into East Kentucky, kind of starting right at Oklahoma, coming up through Arkansas. They just wind their way up through there. Why is it that they're smooth and rolling? And why is it the Alps are sharp? Here's the reason the Alps are sharp and the Matterhorn is sharp, because on all sides of it were massive glaciers at one time. And when a glacier comes down off those mountains, as the snow piles up and it packs thicker and thicker, and it piles up more than it melts each summer, pretty soon over a period of several thousand years, you got an ice pack there. And that ice pack, gravity starts slowly inching it down those mountains, and as it goes, it picks up rocks, and those rocks on the bottom of it start scraping things off. And after 100,000 years or 200, however long it is, maybe just a few thousand years, it just scrapes and wears those mountains down to where those valleys are scooped out, kind of rounded like this as they come down. Those are called glaciated valleys, and the sharpness of the peaks are that way. And you look at the rocks down at the bottom, and a lot of them be this big around, be flat on the bottom. They'll have scrapes on the bottom of them because they've been locked in ice, scraping down that mountain. And that's why that echo works, because when you holler up one of those hollers that are huge, that noise, it's smooth, and the sound doesn't get thrown in 1,000 different directions. It's smoothed out because of that glaciated action, and it comes back at you. Echo. Well, remember something about echo. Catechism means to hear back what you have been told. You learn the answers to the questions, and then you hear them back. That's the way it works. Well, let's get started here. Oh, 76. No, that's not where we are. 74. Yeah, if I'm sued by my neighbor about some property, am I to have a jury trial? A jury to try the case? Yes. Answer. Here's the response, the echo that you learned. You're to repeat back what you learned. Yes. if the amount in dispute is more than $20. Where does it say that? In our Constitution of the United States? Yes. Yes. In the Bill of Rights or in the Constitution of the United States. It says that. Right to trial by jury. Amendment 7. You're entitled to a jury trial in a non-criminal matter if the case in controversy is at least $20. Now, is that still true? Well, remember our Constitution of the United States limits foremost and is targeted toward the general government in Washington, D.C., all three branches of it. It was not intended at all to apply to limit the powers of state government or what state government wanted to do. At all. It is a perversion of our Constitution of the United States that has happened, by the way. And it happened through the 14th Amendment. That's something we can talk about later, but right here, this Stansbury, when he wrote his catechism, like published it in 1828, there was no 14th Amendment. There were no what we call civil. We didn't talk about civil rights. No, we talked about fundamental rights straight from God. Civil rights are, if they're true authority, they came from God, but they came through governments to me, and I can get a fishing license that comes through governments, you see. A roofer's license, a law license, that comes through government. But there are those permissions, that duties that God gives you directly. You've heard me say this. Well, it was meant only to apply to the general government in Washington, D.C. So this provision that says you're entitled to a jury trial if the case in controversy is over $20 or more, whatever kind of property it is, could be $20 or more in damages, or a piece of property or a horse worth $20 or more. And they could say that because our Constitution of the United States says Congress has the authority to fix the worth of the dollar. Have they done that? Well, they did a long time ago, but they don't even try anymore. $20 isn't worth $20 now. $20 isn't worth nothing. The value of the penny, the dime, the nickel, the quarter, the half dollar, the dollar is not even close to what it was worth back in put in place. But our Constitution says that weights and measures shall be fixed. Well, that's what it says in the law of God in the Bible. But why? Because if weights and measures aren't fixed by government authority, and if there is no crime to change them anytime you want, anywhere across all of the states of the United States, commerce would come to a halt. I'd jump in my old jalopy. I'd drive down. I'd cross the river at St. Louis. I hightail it across Missouri, and I run out of gas in Kansas. I stop at the gas station. I look up, it says gas is this much a gallon. I know what a gallon is. The same thing it is back in my neck of the woods. I get to Wyoming, it says a gallon's this much. I know what a gallon is. Because weights and measures, according to our Constitution of the United States, the general government in Washington, D.C., has power to fix weights and measures and enforce it all over the country. If you go to a gas station, the feds make trips to that gas station often and make sure those pumps are calibrated properly. Not only does the feds do it, but your state, likely, if they want to, they can do the same thing to make sure that everybody's conforming to federal law. They can do that if they want, and some states do. Because if they don't do that, if somebody travels from another state to their state, they won't want to do that because they won't know what a gallon is and what it's worth. And they don't want to come into a state like that. They might get ripped off and not even know it. So the governments of those states, it's a vested interest of them to make sure weights and measures are all the same. I think I told you I went to the Smithsonian Institute back when I was in politics. I was in Washington a lot. I was running for U.S. Congress. I went to the Smithsonian a few times, and I remember seeing a lot of interesting things there. One thing I saw was a bushel basket made of brass. A bushel basket made of brass. And that bushel basket that I saw was the official bushel basket that Congress had authorized to be made precisely. That was the standard for what a bushel was in the entire United States. And if there was anybody said this is a bushel, didn't conform to that thing, they possibly could be prosecuted for a crime. Did you know in the Bible it's a criminal act? It was a capital crime act to not adhere to the national establishment, which God established in the Bible, of weights and measures. That's why the units of measurement in the Bible are so important. But the first principle is this, not that we have the same names of measurement and all that. That's all right if we want to. But the point is, the principle from the Bible that our common law recognizes, our Constitution uses, is that the whole nation will be under the same weights and measures standards, and that the feds have authority to enforce it and throw somebody's carcass in jail if they don't do it. Listen, it goes along with the counterfeiting parts of our Constitution. Our Constitution says that counterfeiting the current coin and securities of the United States is a crime. Well, it mentions it as such, and Congress has authority to stop it. That is a legitimate and lawful, even from the law of the Bible, jurisdiction of that far off government in Washington, D.C. There are a few things that are national defense, justice, weights and measures. Okay, why am I saying all this? Because if I have to have in controversy at least $20 worth of property or more to get into a federal court, and that $20 fluctuates day by day, moment by moment, and year by year. How do we know? How can we apply that provision of our Constitution? Answer, we can't. And we lose jury trial. Do you think that it's any accident that we have this beast called the Federal Reserve Bank that manipulates the dollar and has been doing so since 1913, according to how they want it to play, how they want to play with that value to steal money from the rest of the world and Americans especially? That's against God's law, and it's a capital crime according to the Bible. They're doing it and been doing it. So this provision of our Constitution has become meaningless. What has Congress done? Instead of taking control of the situation, which our Constitution requires, and setting the value of the dollar according to a certain weight of silver, which they did when the country started in 1792 after our Constitution was put in place in 1789. By 1792, Congress had passed an act defining precisely, under authority of the Constitution, under the weights and measures clause, establishing the value of a dollar according to a certain weight of silver. Now they had fixed it, and it stayed that way, and people could plan for the future. You can't plan for the future, friends, if you never know where the dollar is. Inflation is never ending. I heard Trump say the other day at the State of the Union address, I think he said it, I heard it somewhere. He was announcing that inflation has dropped to an all-time low of just over a percent a year. Well, that's good, of course. But why is there any inflation at all? Because Congress is not doing their job. They're not fixing the value of money, and the Federal Reserve Bank is in total control of that, doing whatever they want to their advantage. It's a private bank, friends, private shareholders. There's nothing federal about it, and there are no reserves. That's all hooey. That's all to fool you. People say the Federal Reserve Bank is neither federal nor does it have any reserves. That's true, but in another sense, no, really. The Federal Reserve Bank controls the federal government of the United States. De facto, that means in fact. The law doesn't say they're in control, but they are, in fact. It's kind of like this is what happens with governments. King Henry VIII, you've heard of him. He had 6 wives, had 3 of them heads chopped off. He was a nasty man. Had personal self-worth problems, identity crisis problems, self-worth. He wanted to be a mighty warrior, but he really was just a fat little spoiled brat and always had been. So he wanted to be a man. That's what men want, by the way, ladies. Didn't you figure that out? They want to be men. And it's a hard road to hoe. How do you become a man in this crazy effeminate world? That drive is still in every man. Have you noticed men have receded from appearance, positions, upfront positions, as I call them, front and center positions? They're not the newscasters, the congressmen. They're not the state legislators, the mayors of cities. They don't get the attention. If you run for office as a woman today, you'll win. I have friends up in the Dakotas. Dear friends have been awful nice to me. And they both ran for precinct committeeman. He lost and she won. I was kind of surprised. But that's the way it is all over the nation. I don't care what you run for. You've got an advantage if you're a female. That's a spirit of madness, friends. Why? Well, as you've heard me say before, it's upside down. According to Isaiah chapter 3, verse 12, it's the judgment of God upon us. Not that girls are bad. I love them dearly. I got 5 daughters. I got, I'm a dozen granddaughters or something. I can't even keep track. I got this many grandchildren, but I'm off on that. 1 or 2 I've lost because there have been some come along. But at any rate, I like girls, I've always liked them. Always like girls. Guys like girls, but what guys want to do is be men, and it's hard. They have to prove themselves. You say, well, women do too. No, women don't have to. That's not the way God wired them. Women just come out. It's called coming out. Every culture does it that way. Down in New Orleans, in the French culture, they called it debutante, I believe, don't they, Miss Francine? Is that it? I think it is. And they have a ball, and they just bring the girl out, and she's dressed real nice, and it's her coming out. Men don't have a coming out. Men got to prove themselves, and it's true in every culture and everything. So men are now trying to prove themselves, doing manly things, separating themselves from the effeminate world. They don't want to be a part of it. No, they want to do guy things. I knew a lady at home, no kidding. She worked for me when I clerked for an appellate judge. She worked for me, typed all my stuff up and helped me. Really liked her. Well, she did that for the appellate judge, and his office was in the county courthouse because he lived there. Had a place upstairs. Later on, she wanted to run for court clerk because she got to kind of understand how the courts work, and she did. She became clerk of the court in that county. And she'd show me pictures of her husband, and he was a nice guy. He spent all of his time hunting and fishing. I don't mean some of his time, all of his time. He just quit working pretty near and was hunting, fishing, trying to bring home food that way. And boy, he would do it too. You put all your time into hunting and fishing, you can bring home a lot of meat, and he did. But he didn't want any part of the world that was turning effeminate. And pretty soon he said, "I don't need this anymore." And he just kind of faded away and went off into the woods and spent his time hunting, fishing, taking care of himself. And last I heard, it's kind of funny. Marriage fell apart, and it got worse from there. And wow, I don't want to. The rest of it's so ugly, but I'm just making the point. I like her. She's always treated me so nice and helpful and all. But see, I'm not saying I don't like the girls. It's just that God puts things upside down. You want to read about how men are judged? Read the story of Deborah. Deborah was Deborah. That's the way you say it in Hebrew, I guess. Deborah. Well, God said to the man that was supposed to lead the army in battle, he said, he wanted Deborah to go with him. Well, I get that. I like to have Mrs. Brent with me most all the time. But he knew that Deborah just gave him a bit of confidence. She was a good old gal, put it that way. She was. But he said, because you did this, this, and this, whatever it was, she's going to get the credit for winning this battle, and she's not even going to do anything. You're going to command the troops. Deborah never commanded the troops. That's not what happened. Scholars of Hebrew, Semitic tongues that say things like that never happened. Just read it. Just a matter of reading, just simply going back and getting the facts and doing your own looking. And God said, I'm judging you, and they're going to get the credit. The woman's going to get the credit. Well, that's what happened in that case. Well, I was going to get back and talk about, what happened back there at Gettysburg. Wow, there was something really important there I wanted to say about Gettysburg when they got there. Oh, and I was going to say, you read different accounts of different men that were there. When they were young men, they got older, they wrote down eyewitness accounts of their firsthand experience. Now, that's how you learn what's going on in a battle. And this one young fella wrote all about it, and he wrote about, we're talking about the influences of Rome and the influences of other religions that had crept in, were trying to take over. And they hired, this true story, and this fella talks about it. They needed somebody who could get provisions from the local inhabitants, which were Dutch and German immigrants that came there that wanted no part of the war on either side. They saw how stupid and bloody and awful it was, and so they just said, we're not part of this. They were the Quakers and the German and Dutch reform groups, but they were prosperous people. They liked to farm. The Germanic peoples like to farm and do engineering. They like to build things. Barns, they start with barns. And they do innovative things. They were the gunsmiths in America, the gunsmiths. They were the clockmakers. They were the ones that were at the forefront of making the intricate parts for railroad cars when the railroads got started. And even the axles themselves, which of course are a high precision part of has to be perfectly straight. I can't be off a microcosm of an inch. It has to be perfectly straight. And the wheels have to be perfectly round or it tears the car up. They're the ones that did all those things, and they were there. And when the Army got there, of course, the U.S. Army, they lived off the land quite a bit, and everything was requisitioned from the locals. If they could get food or horses, they just took them. They'd pay them for them, but I wouldn't want somebody to take my stuff if they paid me or not. But of course, our Constitution of the United States gives provision for that, but they got to pay. But in order to have somebody that could do that, they had to have a man that didn't have any feelings. He had to go into a lady's home and say, I want all your butter, all your cheese, everything you made from last year, and then find it by force and take a detail of men with him that had guns and clubs to do it. And those Germanic Dutch people wouldn't do that. They'd hide their stuff or take it out in the woods and hide it when they knew where they were coming. So what they did was, now this is according to this fellow I read, they needed somebody that had something less than Christian sensibilities to do this. Because it's so ugly. And of course, most of the troopers were of Christian culture of various kinds. So the Jewish people were there, and they gravitated to those positions, and they were the ones in charge of the details that went out and took things from people, provisions for the army. And to give them incentive, they gave them, the U.S. Army gave them by contract, a percentage of everything they could find and gather from the local inhabitants. It was a terrible way to run things, but that's what they did. And this fellow was talking about, this fellow was assigned to their unit. He was a Jewish fellow, and he shared a tent with him. And he wrote in his journal, he kept a journal, how depressed this guy would get when he'd go 2 or 3 days and he couldn't find. He knew they had the stuff hidden, and he wanted to just take it from them. Horses, harness, wagons, food, stuff that these folk could work very hard in harvest and planting to compile for their own families. That's the ugliness of war. Well, why? Well, what does it cost now? Now we're talking about federal court. Remember, our Constitution of the United States only applies to federal courts, and the limitation is $20. And there's certain ways to get in a federal court, and that's courts of exceedingly limited jurisdiction. One of the things is you got to have a case worth over $20. Well, because of inflation, listen to this. Because of inflation, when I was in law school, in order to get, well, I had to learn this. In order to get into federal court, you had to claim a loss that was worth at least more than, no, more than, not at least, but more than $50,000. Why? Well, $20. What's $20? Will that buy you a candy bar today? Hardly. I don't know. It'd buy you 3 or 4 cups of coffee, maybe, you know. Yeah. Well, that's what they say, 50,000. Now, no, it wasn't 50,000. It was 10,000. I'm sorry. When I was in law school, it was over $10,000. I remember we had to learn, or we wouldn't pass if we, on this point, if a lot of folk thought $10,000 was enough. It's not. It had to be $10,000 and 1 penny, and 1 penny. And just recently, as you know, it's not 10,000 plus a penny. Now it has to be 10,000 plus 5 pennies, because the pennies aren't being made. You see, in 1961, England had a coin they called a tuppence. A tuppence. That was, I believe, the smallest coin they had. It was a tenth of a penny. And then they had a halfpenny. You've heard this. But then they had a penny. Remember, in some of you that are old enough, remember that famous song in Mary Poppins about the tuppence? Mary Poppins was placed, the story was placed in England in about the year 1910. Well, they had tuppences then, tenth of a penny, 10 penny, short, tuppence for short. Tuppence. They did away with those in 61. This is a progression. Now, whether or not they have a halfpenny, I used to have some English halfpennies. People, they'd somehow find their way over here. Sometimes I'd find Canadian pennies, which were the same size as ours. You can still see those once in a while, but the pennies are going, well, they're gone. They don't make them. They went from copper to aluminum, and now nothing. That's the way it works. Inflation, you see, who cares about a penny anymore? It's not worth enough to even give a thought to. So it was $10,000 when I was in school. And then later on, it went to $50,000. And if I'm not mistaken, if you don't claim damages of at least $100,000 or more, you can't even get into federal court in what we call diversity jurisdiction. I'm on a roll, so I guess I'll stay on what we're doing here. I'm kind of enjoying it. We're moving ahead a little. Well, it says here, the next question, amount in disputes is more than $20. And, you know, I've lost track. I haven't had occasion to be on a diversity case, but I know it just keeps going up. You know, 10,000 when I first heard about it. Now it's 50, and then 75, and then 100. That's because of inflation. The more dollars there are pumped into the economy, the less they're worth. And that's why when I was a boy, and you maybe were, you could buy a candy bar for a nickel, bottle of pop for a dime. I remember in 72, I was looking for a car. I, of course, wanted a nice one, and a new Chevy Impala 4-door sedan was just over $2,000. Can you believe that? That's how much inflation has gone up, you see. Um, Let's read another question. If a person is charged with a criminal offense, a crime, must he be confined in a jail? Must he be jailed or otherwise prevented from going away? In other words, home arrest or something, till a grand jury has heard the accusation and proof against him. Now, notice here, his language is not consistent. I'm going to try to change it a little. I know what he means. You're not charged with a crime in the federal courts and the federal judiciary until a grand jury indicts you. He's mixing this up a little bit, but here's the point is making. How can a man be restrained from running away from justice, from fleeing justice, once a grand jury indicts him? Before an indictment, he can do anything he wants. Pretty much. He can go where he wants. But once a grand jury indicts him, and then he is hauled into court and what we call arraigned, in other words, the charges against him are read to him so he knows, how can he be prevented from getting rabbit in his blood and hightailing it for Texas, as we used to say? Well, he can be put on bail. That means if somebody will agree to forfeit a certain sum of money, if he does flee justice and not return to be tried, the government gets a lot of money, and bail is set hundreds of thousands and millions, depending upon how much money a man can put up for bail. Who has power to say how much money they shall agree to forfeit to bail? How much? Well, the judge, not a jury, the judge before whom the man is accused. May he fix any sum he pleases? And the answer is no. He can't just do anything he wants. $10 million, $100 million. No. The sum of bail is to be according to the nature of the crime and the danger of the accused man's running away. But it may not be made so great as to be cruel or unjust. In other words, bail, if a judge sets a bail so that it is impossible to pay, forcing the man to be jailed, because if you don't get bail, you're going to be held in jail. It's jail or bail when you're accused, pretty much. But if bail can be granted, it's the policy of our common law to grant bail. Why? Because being confined to a space that's called jail, whatever the space is contrary. Now I'm getting down to the bottom here of our common law tradition. It's contrary to the trust settlement that God has made with Adam's race, which is to be fruitful, multiply, and scatter. Listen, if you're locked in jail, can you multiply? How many, let's get real here. How many men are there in jail who are dying for sex? Do you think it's any mystery that America jails more persons per capita than any country in the world? That's a direct mitigation, a direct attack of the devil himself on the covenant of God, the trust settlement of God, to do two things: make babies and scatter over the land, and occupy it and make it productive. That's the trust settlement of God at bottom. It's all about land. And jail mitigates against that. It hinders a man fulfilling that. That's why we take it so serious in our common law tradition. That's why we have something we've developed called habeas corpus. It's a tool. Habeas corpus is a tool where a man, they call it the great writ, where a man can say, wait a minute, my being in jail is unlawful. Judge, free me. Gives absolute power to a court to free a man on the spot that he judges is not jailed lawfully. Other all the rest of the world doesn't do that. And here in America, habeas corpus has been whittled down to pretty near nothing. Fancy motions like 2255 and all that. Our Constitution of the United States says the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, except in time of war, where it's absolutely necessary to preserve our country. If you want to read about habeas corpus, what it is, and how it played out in America, I commend to you the book Excellence of the Common Law by yours truly. I've got a lot of examples of how habeas corpus has been ignored in America. Real cases. Oh, some real cases. One of them involved, well, but two of the cases involved Abraham Lincoln. In one case, he argued for a slave owner who had brought his slaves over across the river from Kentucky to work his farm in Illinois. And they got rabbit in their blood and absconded. Some do-gooders filed a petition asking that the writ of habeas corpus be issued to the jailer, commanding the jailer to bring the slaves before the court and prove that he had jailed them lawfully. And then other cases I put in there during this horrible war between the states. That was a watershed event. That war, because it tested our Constitution in so many places, it didn't always work out right. For whatever reason, that's why I say it was stupid. It was more destructive to our country. In the end, war never, it may be the only option if somebody attacks you, but things are never better. There's always a terrible damage that'll come back and hurt you. So bail may not be fixed however the judge wants. It can't be so great as to be unattainable. Are offenses ever punished by a fine? Fine, F-I-N-E, that is, by obliging the offender to pay a sum of money. Obliging him, that means obligating him. Now, this isn't a matter of debt or contract. This is a matter of obligation, obliging him. Once the judge pronounces it, it is an obligation. No contract was there. And the answer is, may there be such offenses? And the answer is yes. But here, the same rule applies. The sum must not be made out of proportion to the offense and the circumstances of the offender. Out of proportion to the offense and the circumstances of the offender. What does that mean? That means that any penalty, whether it be the death penalty or a fine of $25 and everything in between, any penalty, thrown in jail for whatever, our Constitution of the United States requires that it not be out of proportion to the seriousness of the crime committed. In other words, you shouldn't get the death penalty for shoplifting. You understand what I'm saying? Now, that's the test whereby we may know what cruel and unusual punishment is in any different situation. See, cruel and unusual punishment it's different depending upon the person and the crime. It's cruel and unusual punishment to fine a man $150,000 in a criminal tax case if he doesn't have the ability to make but $15,000 a year. A lot of people like that. Who are you kidding? That's cruel. Because it's not doable. It puts a man in debt the rest of his life. The burden of it. It's wrong. So the Eighth Amendment to our Constitution forbids cruel and unusual punishment. Yep. Well, in England, during the time of our war with them, and during that time and beyond, England became known as a nation of shopkeepers. A nation of shopkeepers. The most powerful segment of the English English people were the shopkeepers because not only were there more of them than anybody else, but they had money. Why? Because the empire, the British Empire, had grown and the natural resources flowing in, and we were part of that at one time, the natural resources from America flowing into England was almost of inestimable worth. They had a powerful navy and no trees to make ships. America had all that. We had agricultural products, we had timber, we had furs, we had minerals, timber, lumber. We had liquor. We had moonshine type of liquor, corn liquor. We had rum. We had tobacco. We had sugar cane. We had, watch this, you talk about naval stores. Not only did we have the best wood, timber in the world to make ships, warships, and other kind of ships, the hardest wood ever discovered, cannonballs couldn't penetrate it, called live oak down in Louisiana. We even had that. We also had hemp. Yeah, hemp, lots of it. George Washington on his plantation in Virginia made most of his money growing hemp. That means Mary G. Warner. That's right. Of course, people weren't smoking joints and toking it back then. They were making rope, and rope, without rope, the Navy of Britain couldn't have been powerful. They needed timber and rope. And hemp is about the best rope you can make out of natural material, being strong. Hemp. The rope makers of Boston, well, they made a lot of money there in Boston, pounding out rope, beating out rope, twisting rope. It was a large industry making sails. We had the stuff to do that with. The cotton stuff started later, but hemp was big. Hemp was bigger in America than tobacco, and tobacco was big. Hemp was bigger. Well, we had a lot of money. That's true. But no matter how much a fellow has, you could have a fine or bail that was cruel and unusual because it was unattainable. That's how important liberty is. Liberty, fundamentally, above all things, according to William Blackstone in his commentaries on our common law, liberty to start fundamentally is freedom. Watch me, watch me. Liberty begins, and this is the biggest thing in liberty and freedom, is the freedom to go where you want to go when the desire hits you. Why is that important? Again, the covenant of God to scatter, to be fruitful and scatter. You can't make babies when you're locked up in jail. And you can't scatter. And all of us can do both of those or one of those. And that's what we need to be doing. That's what God demands. That's why he puts this impulse in us. We're teaching the Declaration of 76, clause by clause and blow by blow. Presently, go to commonlawyer.com. You can join us. But one of the complaints that we had against the King of England and his cronies in business was that they had passed laws that prevented Americans from entering new lands. In other words, they were told you can't go west of the Alleghenies. Well, England had lost control of us, but that's what God wanted. That's what God still wants, present tense. That's what's made America powerful because that was our policy. We just kept hacking and tramping our way west. That's what God wants, and that's what God blesses. We can still do it right now. We got all the way west. We kind of overlooked the middle. And then we filled up the Great Plains, and we finally, enough buffalo got out the way. We started farming, raising wheat, and grazing cattle. Tried to graze buffalo, but they'd tear up fences. You know, those things are so tough. Started putting telegraph poles down the railroads going west. The buffalo herds would come along and scratch their backs on those poles, and do it so much that those poles get to leaning one way or another, then they get loose, then they just fall down in a loamy, sandy soil. They said, well, we can fix that. What we're going to do, we'll embed railroad spikes in them up as high as a buffalo can reach with his back, and then that'll keep them from scratching themselves on, and that'll stop that. It just made it worse because the buffaloes that made the ability to scratch even better, and those pointy railroad spikes sticking out of there. They just loved that. Well, that, of course, gave them also a more friction of a handle to just lift those poles right up out of the ground. They did. You take an animal that weighs 2,200 pounds, a bull, buffalo. Well, that's what happened there. The only way to stop the madness of the destruction was they had to reduce the population. Of course, that happened. Well, they didn't go extinct. I read about a famous rancher who was, Goodnight. He and his wife tried to ranch there in North Texas. And they found out they couldn't get through the winters because those northers had come down and just cattle had starved to death in the winter, wouldn't have anything to eat. They'd freeze to death. They finally found this low place in this canyon out in the escarpment. And they said, we'll build our ranch house down here. In the wintertime, we'll come down in here and the wind won't blow so hard and our cattle may survive because that wind chill factor, the conditions, that's what makes life miserable in the cold. Well, they did that. And they were able to preserve their herd through the winter. But about that time, Mrs. Goodnight, she was the lady of the ranch there, she noticed all these little tiny buffalo calves, little calves wandering in, 2, 3, a dozen here and there. She started bottle feeding them. Of course, she felt sorry for them. They obviously didn't have mothers. But what had happened was they were shooting so many buffalo out on the plains at that time, they were just wiping them out. And they didn't shoot the calves because their hides weren't as big, and they were using the hides, you see. The Industrial Revolution had really picked up in the East, the cotton mills and the steel mills. And what they needed, they'd have a power source, a steam engine that ran everything in the factory. And the way they transferred the power from that steam engine to the different machines, the drill presses, whatever they had, was through a series of pulleys. And on those pulleys would be leather belts. And buffalo hide was what they used for the leather belts. And millions of buffalo is what made possible the great wealth and prosperity of America in those days. They didn't have any other material that was cost effective they could use we had one of those. See, when I was growing up, we had what we called a workshop. We had everything there. We had everything. We had a drill press and a small drill press. It wasn't a very big building, kind of a shed, but across the top of the shed was an axle that ran and it had wooden wheels on it. And attached to those wooden wheels, we had a wheel for the drill press. And down here, we had an engine that drove the whole caboodle it's a natural gas engine from the oil field. It piped that natural gas off the oil well in there, and that one longer motor, little tiny thing about that big, but just pop, 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 that thing would keep that rolling. You could actually take steel and get that drill press, throw that clutch in, and you go drill right through steel or wood or whatever else you wanted to drill through. Well, that's what they did. But we had belts that were made out of a material that was more modern. It wasn't just plain leather. Leather wears out quick. That's the reason why they kept needing this. Well, finally, there wasn't any more buffalo, so they started developing other things, other material to make the belts out of. Well, Mrs. Goodnight started her own herd of buffalo, and it became large. And that was the beginning of the resurgence, the rescuing of the herds, and we have them now up in Canada, down here. We eat buffalo meat, as you know, and we wear clothes made out of you can buy socks and hats made out of the wool, as it were, the hair or the hide of that animal. You can get on the internet and find them. People making fortunes doing that now. But we have it in balance, and man has taken dominion over it, and the buffalo do not dominate the Great Plains, but they're there. Agricultural crops dominate the plains now, but then we have now filled that. Now, right now, as I speak, for the first time, we're populating the Rocky Mountain states. Be fruitful, multiply, and cover the earth.